Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I am with the International Studies Association. Thank you so much for joining us today for A World Order Out of Balance, Power, Populism, and the Shaping of Tomorrow's Global Order. This event is co-organized with the European International Studies Association, and Rebecca Petty here is going to be moderating the event and representing EISA. So Rebecca, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening or good morning. It depends on what time zone you are. I'm Rebecca Petty from the University of Macedonia and the EISA. And honestly, I'm excited to chair today's panel. This is the second online event jointly organized by EISA and ISA. And it's a great opportunity to harness the knowledge and intellectual capital of our academic communities on both sides of the Atlantic. I'd like to extend my warm thanks to Sarah Dorr from ISA and her team for our excellent cooperation in making this happen. Today's topic has sparked tremendous interest, and we have a record number of registered participants. This reflects the growing debate around the shifting international order, which of course intensified recently, and of course reflects the stellar panel we have with us today. I'm delighted to welcome Sandra De Stradi from University of Freiburg and Reichman University, Barry Posehn from MIT, Natalie Tozzi from Istituto Affari Internazionali, and Bill Wolforth from Dartmouth. Without further delay, let's kick off the discussion, which I'm sure it will be very, very interesting, with a short tour de la table. I'd like to start by asking each of you the million-dollar question. In what kind of international order do we live today? Sandra, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for having me at this event. It's a great pleasure. So I think we're hearing everywhere that we are facing a world order that is in a status of flux, of greater fragmentation. We hear, about a return of geopolitics, increasing conflict intensity since, Russia's attack against Ukraine. We hear about the crisis of globalization, driven by increasing protectionism. So these are some of the trends I think we're talking about and reading about all the time. And of course, now the Trump presidency has certainly, accelerated, intensified some of these trends, which were there, however, I think before, driven by the first Trump administration as well, but not only. So if we think about, if we want to call it liberal world order, of course, it's a crisis that has also been unleashed by the core of the order itself. I will talk more about populism later on, but I think there are four trends or four things I would like to emphasize beyond all these things we keep hearing. And they are very much driven by populism and by the diffusion of populism worldwide, so also beyond the US. And in my view, these are first the greater personalization of decision-making we're seeing everywhere. I mean, at its most extreme form in the US right now to observe, but not only there, of course. As a consequence of this, the second trend I would see is this greater unpredictability we face. It's not a complete unpredictability, but more personalized decision-making certainly matters here. A third trend, I think, is the greater polarization we are seeing in domestic debates, amplified by social media. And this then translates into the international level. So we have this greater politicization of foreign policy, of international issues worldwide, certainly, not just in the West, also in the global South, for example. And the fourth trend, I think, is a greater transactionalism. So this, moving away from this very norm-driven approach to world politics on the part of populists in the global north, but this dovetails very well with the approach of a number of other countries in other parts of the world, which are much more open about being transactional in what they do. And I think I'll stop here because that was just, I think, the short warm-up round, right?
Yep. Bill, what do you think?
Well, I join Sandra in just expressing my thanks for being part of this. This is a great idea, and it's a lot of fun. I'm glad to see so many people signing up. Before I answer your direct question, I want to just express my deep and heartfelt sympathies to all those American voters who voted for Donald Trump because they felt he would pierce and shove aside the American foreign policy blob and move us toward a grand strategy of restraint. To all those people who thought he was going to do that, I'm very sorry that you were thinking that was going to happen, because obviously that's not what we're seeing. But to your question, I sort of, in my, now thinking about it, getting older, the older side of my career, I've been really thinking about these questions for probably, I hate to think about it, for 40 years. About the relationship between world order on the one hand and the distribution of material power on the other hand. So whereas I don't dispute any of the more immediate causes of the changes that we're seeing, to my mind, I naturally go to sort of underlying causes that go beyond Donald Trump and other personalistic leaders. And I think the world order as we began to know it in the unipolar period post-1991, that order was already under stress and in some degree unraveling before the first Trump administration, not to mention the second one. And as the title of our session describes it, it's a world order potentially out of balance. And so my basic argument would be is that the world order seems out of balance in some ways because the distribution of power in the world is more balanced. The way you got a seemingly orderly so-called liberal international order was in part by an unusual and ultimately temporary concentration of power in the United States. There was even, I would say, a necessary condition of even the aspiration towards anything one would call a world order as opposed to a regional one, and especially one based on liberal rules and principles, was the ascendance of the United States to a position of unrivaled power. And so what we're witnessing now is simply partially the result of the beginnings of the decline of that position of power, which enabled the order that we're discussing.
Thank you, Bill. Barry?
So it's actually quite hard, I think, to say anything that people haven't already heard, not just from our previous two speakers, but probably heard from somewhere in the last 2 weeks or read somewhere in the last 2 weeks. So I'll just kind of introduce a couple of bullet points just so people know where I'm coming from. I think Bill and I are probably in agreement on the distribution of capabilities in the world and how the distribution of capabilities is changing. We just can't decide what to name it. I kind of like John Mearsheimer's discussion of unbalanced multipolarity, even though I don't like the term because it implies there can't be balancing. And the reason why I think John thought that unbalanced multipolarity was so dangerous was because one state was strong enough to bid for hegemony, but other states were strong enough to oppose it. And the only question was when and how. So it makes for a very volatile situation. And I think that's close to the situation that we're in. So I think we have a skewed distribution of power. I think it's important, even though, this is a very general audience and we don't talk about it very much, we have to remind people that nuclear weapons are part of the structure of world politics, and they exert all kinds of influences which torque and bend some of the kinds of predictions and analysis we might make if we were only looking at political factors. I think given the title of this meeting, we have to go beyond, sort of the hard structure of power to talk about some other things. When the classical realist, Hans Morgenthau wrote his great book, hundreds of pages in the middle of it are devoted to nationalism. I think it was the conceit of the post-Cold War order that nationalism had been extirpated. And I think the reality is that nationalism is back. And we really are living in a world of nation states. So from a classical realist point of view, I think it's one of the things we have to understand that these are nation states. So there's a way that the popular views are injected in a random way into foreign policy, and often not in a particular good way. And I think, thirdly, I think that what people viewed as a kind of a structure of economic relations was not a cause of the order we lived in, but a consequence. And I think I doubt we'll see a complete collapse of international trade and investment, but I think all the patterns are going to be seriously torqued by kind of a neo-mercantilist mentality. The idea that international transactions, international trade, international investment supply chains should be pursued because of the basis they make for an ever more efficient division of labor and an ever more better life, basically, for the consumer. I think that notion of how to think about international economics is going into abeyance, and that's going to make life a lot more difficult for business people and governments because all kinds of other considerations are going to be intruded into these kinds of things, as we're seeing with the new president and the Panama Canal Zone.
Thank you, Barry. Natalie, what do you think?
So a couple of set of remarks. I mean, some more related to the international system and others more to international order. And obviously, one would assume, and one has always assumed, that these things are obviously interrelated. But I think what's interesting about this moment, and in particular, the kind of dynamics unleashed by Donald Trump's return, is that whereas it creates, I think, actually quite a bit of confusion in terms of where we're headed as far as the international system is concerned, it tragically is pointing to quite a bit of clarity as far as where international order or disorder is concerned. And let me kind of explain a little bit what I mean by this. I mean, I think as far as the system, there's been for years now, I mean, I would say since the global financial crisis, a debate both in the world of academia and of practice concerning how the international system was changing. Is it still a unipolar system? And of course, if you look at particular sort of indicators, military power, for instance, it still actually does have, in many respects, those unipolar characteristics. Is it a new bipolar system? If you're looking at it through the economic or tech lens, it actually looks like a new bipolarity is emerging. Is it a multipolar system? I don't think I need to say too much about this. Or is it actually a non-polar system? And I think, what's been fascinating about these last few weeks is that we really do see indications that there's everything happening at the same time, right? So indeed, Trump would not be able to do what he's doing, or at least what he's saying he's going to do or threatening to do, be it on tariffs, be it on military power and kind of, mass expulsion of civilian populations, unless there was obviously that sort of reservoir, right, of kind of both military power and economic power, which is obviously connected to the role of the dollar in the international system. So there's obviously something to be said still about unipolarity. Likewise, what we've been seeing again over the last few weeks, if we think particularly about the tech sphere, AI, DeepSeek, there's obviously a story of bipolarity kind of there, which has been kind of affirming or reaffirming itself. It is very clear that there are different holes in the international system. There are a number of places that are obviously increasingly making their voices heard, also in reaction to Donald Trump, with some degree of effectiveness, actually. And then you have, I think, probably the most interesting story of all, which is really one of, sort of non-polarity. I mean, I find actually quite interesting the way in which, with the exception of course, many in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe, I would add maybe South Korea and Japan, much of the rest of the world is kind of, I would say, rather unfazed by the arrival of Donald Trump. I mean, if you kind of think of the Indias of this world, right? there isn't really much of a sense that this is necessarily good or necessarily bad, which I think kind of speaks to, in many respects, by non-polarity. I think, what's interesting here is that there isn't a clear sort of ideological glue in many respects, sort of political ideological glue that sort of binds, in many respects, these countries and therefore non-poles together. Anyway, so I think as far as the international system is concerned, the events over the last few weeks have really been, in a sense, rather confusing because they seem to corroborate different theses all at the same time. As opposed to the sort of far sadder story, I think, which really has to do with international order. And here too, there has been a debate evolving over the years. As it became clear that unipolarity was fading, there was a sense of, hey, we either revise international institutions and make them more inclusive, more representative, or ultimately there will be something else that will be kind of popping up instead. And so that debate, in the sense, which of course never, those reforms never really came about, kind of really led to a situation which I think was, where the debate was only up until a few months ago. Well, it would have been nice to retain one international order, perhaps with a reform and revision of kind of rules and norms and institutions to, as I said, make them more representative of the international system, but it would still be one order, right? And increasingly as time went by, and in particular as a consequence of the war in Ukraine and other developments, there is a sense of, maybe it would not be one order, but it would be a kind of multi-order, right? Which isn't ideal, of course, but it's kind of better than nothing. I think what we're beginning to see, these last few days and weeks, is really, in a sense, the sort of illusion of that multi-order, and the fact that actually, once you get rid of an order, you have this order instead. And this kind of all-out attack on international law, on international institutions, including the very sort of basics, right, of kind of territorial integrity and sovereignty, right? And the idea that, say, spheres of influence are actually a good thing, really, and it's not just something that Vladimir Putin says, it's now something that Donald Trump says as well, right? And therefore, probably China will kind of think, well, that's not a bad idea too. Kind of really speaks to, again, sort of there's far greater clarity, and it's obviously not a positive one, as far as, where that debate has been going, and from, end of the liberal international order to the illusions of, hopes for reform, perhaps, sort of second best of multi-order, down to, I think, the disorder and the law of the jungle, which I think we're increasingly in.
Thank you, Natalie. Each of you highlighted different perspectives of the current order, and I'm sure our audience, they already have questions, and I want to say that the Q&A box is open to everyone, so please feel free to send in your questions. As I said, each of you highlighted different aspects of the international order, and I wanted to start our discussion, or to focus our discussion now more on polarity. And I want to ask Bill, not so long ago, you argued about the myth of multipolarity, and you introduced the concept of partial unipolarity. So I'm wondering if we will start wondering what's in the name. And in any case, what are the characteristics of the order you describe as partial unipolarity, and what are the consequences of the current order for stability, cooperation, competition in the system? And can you see this order shifting eventually to multipolarity?
Well, those are all great questions, and I think I'm hoping to try to give some controversy here on our panel so that our audience can get entertained by us vigorously disagreeing. But I really do think all of the comments so far are pushing in a similar direction, although we're saying it in different ways. And the way I'm thinking about it is that that the distribution of capability, the ability of states to use resources to do things has, as Barry said, changed enough that revisionist powerful actors can contemplate more ambitious grand strategies at the same time as the United States can believe it has the capability to defend what it has. And the result is much greater contestation and a decline of this aspiration towards a global rules-based order that we see. And so I'm just going to make a few points and then end up exactly where you wanted me to go. And maybe putting these points on the table will be a way of getting people to vigorously disagree, or maybe they'll just ignore what I'm saying. But super quick points. The first, just to clarify here, not to get too academic, but the first point is that polarity is not order, but it's related to order. So as I mentioned earlier, for 40 years, I'm astonished to say, I've been studying this relationship between material capability and political outcomes like foreign policy and war and grand strategy and order. And I'm acutely aware that the connections between these two things is not simple. Order is rules and principles and ideas and practices that govern or regulate relations in international politics, and polarity is a distribution of military capabilities. The relationship is not simple, but I continue to insist, as I started out, that there is a relationship between the two things. The second point is the one I made in introduction, so I can say it quickly, is that polarity enabled the world order whose fate we're now talking about. It didn't create its particulars, but it enabled it. And the reason is that unipolarity involved such a concentration of power in the United States that it essentially caused other great powers to pursue these restrained grand strategies that reduce great power competition. So suddenly we looked at a world without great power competition. And that enables a way of thinking about order that is not possible when there is great power competition. Whole ideas about things that seem reasonable to do, about aspirations that seem feasible to have, are realistic in that world, and they are not realistic in a world where there is great power competition. And so the United States and its like-minded liberal allies contemplated the idea of spreading their way of doing things to the entire world. But these other great powers, these other potential major powers, when they trimmed their sails, when they pursued their much more restrained grand strategies, that wasn't because they were satisfied with this order. It was because they didn't have the capability to pursue more ambitious grand strategies. So what we're now talking about, the conversation that you're hearing today, is the result of the change, where these powers now think they can pursue more ambitious grand strategies. And that's running into conflict with the status quo powers that think they can sustain it. So that's that ambiguity that is underlying this entire conversation. The balanced power just isn't as clearly concentrated as it once was. But the third point I want to make super quickly is just to note here, because I know a lot of people really love bashing the liberal order. It's hypocrisy. They hate it. American hubris, imperialism, all this sort of stuff. I get that because the hypocrisy was built into the order. But please take a moment to lament it, because it was accompanied by probably the most secure or least warlike international politics we've ever had. You look at any measure you want, there was a huge decline in the problem of war during this period. Reduced threat perceptions, reduced defense expenditures, reduced size of armed forces, reduced amounts of conscription, reduced defense industries, reduced evidence of interstate war, reduced prevalence of civil war. All of that was connected to this order, which was in turn connected to American power in one way or another. And its decline has seen an uptick in all of these indicators of international conflict. The fourth point, super quick, is essentially the one I've been harping on, which is the current disorder is the result of a power distribution that makes dissatisfied powers, but particularly China and Russia, think they can displace the US. I mean, just to stop a moment and think, it's pretty, I mean, the Russian authorities say what they're doing in Ukraine. they consistently say it's not about Ukraine. It's about displacing this US-led order and moving the world to what they call as unipolarity. But notice something. The United States, even under Donald Trump, apparently, isn't saying, oh, okay, I guess we have to go to what you call multipolarity because, gee, we'll just sort of step aside. On the contrary, they are, at relatively cheap cost to themselves, supporting Ukraine and seeking to thwart Putin's ambition to change the world order, hence the struggle that we're seeing. All right, so the fifth and last point is the direct answer to your question. Why do I continue to see this as closer to unipolarity than bi or multipolarity? Again, speaking of polarity, just as a distribution of material capabilities. Well, I think multipolarity is clearly off the table because have multipolarity, you'd have to have a country that's comparable in material strength to the US or China. And I just think that question answers itself. So we don't have multipolarity in terms of power, in terms of military material capabilities. So the whole thing boils down to whether I'm right that we're still closer to unipolarity or my esteemed colleague Jennifer Lind is right in her recent international security article that says we're back to bipolarity. And here I think the gap between the United States and China on key metrics just renders the level of global rivalry between the United States and China less all-encompassing and less violence-producing than what we saw during the Cold War. And I know this is controversial because of China's huge GDP, but the article that you referred to that we published in Foreign Affairs shows how that comparison back to the Cold War shows you why bipolarity is a misleading way of understanding the current international system. And I'll just conclude by saying that's really good news. I mean, it might be bad news for China's aspirations, but it's good news for global security because as bad as the world order now is, as violent as it has become, as much as the peaceful trends of the unipolar era are reversing, we are nowhere close by most measures to the levels of violence that we saw in the bipolar Cold War, in part through the Civil War dynamic. Barry wrote a great article about this that had to do with the proxy effect of great powers pursuing their agendas through proxy means in civil wars. And with that off, that is still not on the table today. So there's some good news here, as alarming as global trends may seem. So I'll conclude there and look forward certainly to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Bill. Barry, I think everyone has already mentioned Trump's second administration. During the first Trump administration, you suggested that Trump is anything but an isolationist, and you described Trump's grand strategy as one of the liberal hegemony. Do you think this strategy persists in the second Trump administration? Has anything changed? And where does the US actually stand in the current international order? And how do you see the America First doctrine shaping its future position?
Well, it's funny it feels funny to come before all of you today and discuss the idea that the Trump administration has a grand strategy that I can somehow discern, right? That said, I will play along, right? So is this illiberal hegemony redux? I mean, that's basically the question. And I would say that it looks that way, right? So when we think back to the first Trump administration, many people expected the administration to be somehow isolationist. It wasn't. When I wrote the illiberal hegemony article, it was taken as a kind of surprising take. But I think what we saw in the first Trump administration was that they didn't like the liberal aspects of the liberal world order very much. They didn't like the liberal aspects of liberal hegemony very much. But Trump himself liked the hegemonic aspects, and so did many people in his administration. Now, that first administration was, a little bit like this one. It included people who were more traditional kind of neocon kind of hawks, and also, some people who were quite skeptical about that, including Trump himself. And since Trump was a novice president with a kind of a weird, sort of inner court around him, those who favored a more traditional U.S. grand strategy could kind of block some of what Trump did. So in the end, I think the strategy was illiberal hegemony, but I think it still retained a surprising, kind of comfort with international institutions, not because Trump was comfortable, but just because he didn't really control all his people, right? I think what we're seeing now is a Trump who not only thinks he's large and in charge, he is large and in charge because he has people around him who will do his bidding, right? So the balance that, seemed to make, take some of the teeth out of Trump's illiberal hegemony, I think that balance is gone, and you're going to see something else. I called it illiberal. People will now compete to give it names. They'll call it mercantile or whatever. I don't know what people will call it, but I think illiberal works pretty good. So what does that mean? It means that Trump still has a inclination to pursue America's interests globally. He just doesn't care about a lot of the sort of ideational and institutional infrastructure that was built, in the post-Cold War world to do it. He just wants what he wants when he wants it. And there is some logic there. And the logic is this transactional logic that America should always end up, at the better end of the deal, which of course is, we translate this into structural terms. It's, we like the unipolar moment. We're not going to let it go. Right. I mean, just to put it in those terms. Now, the first couple of weeks, you could say that there were some sources of confusion here. You might have been able to tell yourself a story, until yesterday, that it was tending towards, hemispheric defense, sphere of influence. We'll have our sphere of influence. Others will have their spheres of influence. You might squint and have been able to tell yourself that story. But it would have been premature. But it looks more like from, some of the other noises he's making about the trade war with the EU, about weighing in to make some deal on Ukraine, about the continuing idea that there needs to be a major competition with China, that he's still interested in sustaining that number one position. Now, I think where Bill and I agree, is that he has enough cards to give it a try, but the other side has enough cards to make it costly. And I guess I'll close by saying that, I'm not going to say this is showtime for somebody's theory or not. It's dramatic, but it's a murky situation. But we are going to get a little bit more insight as we look at process about what structure permits and incentivizes. And, coming back to my earlier remarks, I think we're in a situation that, for my own reasons, which I won't bore you with, I do believe it looks more like multipolarity than anything else. I think it's a weird kind of multipolarity, just like Bill can add his adjective to unipolarity, I can add mine. I'll call it weird for the moment, right? But the basic deal is we have, we have one country that's considerably stronger than the other, and that country is, when we were practicing liberal hegemony, we were a revolutionary state in international politics. And with Trump trying to restore the American unipolar position, we are still a revolutionary state, and we are operating in an ever more resistant medium, right? So if I'm right about that distribution of power, then things are going to be interesting and exciting. I think if Bill is righter than I am, we will see the other's opposition begin to fold up. And we will emerge 2 or 3 years down the road, scratching our heads and go, damn, that Bill Woolforth was right all along. It's still basically unipolar world, and even the Chinese have to kowtow. So a little bit of a test here. We'll see. As Donald Trump likes to say, we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. And let's shift our focus from the US to Europe. Natalie, in a recent piece on Guardian, you discussed the risk of a fragmented Europe and the future of the EU strategic autonomy. Where does Europe stand in this evolving order? And I'm wondering, can the EU stand united in this order and act as a power center? And what does this mean for its strategic autonomy ambitions?
Okay, so we're obviously in a bad place, and that's the short answer. And let me elaborate on it. But let me elaborate on it actually going back to the discussion, between Bill and Barry. And I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure it's what I see. I mean, I think that whereas up until this second Trump administration, you could interpret what Biden was doing as an attempt, albeit, of course, acknowledging that there has been a redistribution of power in the international system, but an attempt at retaining US hegemony and retaining basically that system of rules and norms that the US was has been so instrumental in creating. It seems to me that Trump, as you said, obviously doesn't care, right? But it seems to me that Trump doesn't necessarily want the US to be a hegemon. Trump wants to be indeed the kind of, strongest and kind of fittest in the pack. But it doesn't necessarily, he doesn't necessarily refute the idea that there are other big powers out there. And I think, I at least interpret the way in which his primary foreign policy preoccupations so far have been aimed not only at the Canada, the obvious, the Canada, Mexico, and Panamas of this world, and this goes to this idea of kind of spheres of influence, but indeed the EU, and in the EU, and then I'll come back to the EU to come to your question, Rebecca, but in a very deliberate way aimed at, I would use a stronger term to say, destroy the European Union. And in a sense, once we have a destroyed European Union, and therefore you have a set of European countries, it fits into that kind of worldview in which, you're the strongest you're the leader of that particular sphere, right? And it doesn't necessarily detract from the fact that there may be others. I think it is actually quite significant that, for all the talk of, tariffs on China, actually so far the response towards China has been relatively muted. Tariffs notwithstanding, right? Nothing compared what he's done or said on other parts of the world. I think the one area, but I think this has more to do with Trump's ego, so more to do with agency than with structure, which doesn't quite fit this description, is, I think, his obsession with wanting deals and wanting to kind of be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. And hence, I think he's kind of heard a little bit the music of kind of, maybe you don't really want to throw Ukraine under the bus. And this may end up being your Afghanistan. So I think there's been some sort of partial revision there. I think that this also explains, as today, he's been talking about back to maximum pressure on Iran, but at the same time saying, and hey, I'm open for a nuclear peace agreement. So I think, sort of you have these elements, which I think speak more to his ego and wanting to be a kind of deal maker than with, sort of any kind of reflection of what the international system may be looking at. But back to this question of Europe. So, I think there are some elements that, in a sense, we already knew from Trump 1, yeah? So, the protectionism element, the nationalism element, there's nothing particularly new there. And truth be said, if we go back to 2016, Trump 1, What was, I think, interesting about that moment is that the election of Trump, which followed, of course, the UK referendum on Brexit, actually had a sort of galvanizing effect on Europe. And, you know, there was the sense of, well, you know, as the US temporarily checks out of the order that it has built, Europe, and in particular the European Union, steps in defense of that order. And this is indeed, Rebecca, where, you know, all the debates of strategic autonomy and what have you really came about. Now, the problem that we have now, I think, is twofold. On the one hand, I think that on the Trump side of the equation, alongside the protectionism and the nationalism, there is this revisionism, right? I mean, this imperialism, and also a far more pronounced authoritarianism compared to what we saw the first time round. And more broadly, I would say that there's a far greater degree of commitment, ideological coherence, plan, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that this will be realized, but there is a sense of direction that didn't really seem to be there the first time round. So in a sense, it's a much harder challenge to face compared to last time round. But I think even more of a problem is the fact that on the other side of the equation, on the other side of the Atlantic, it's a fundamentally different Europe compared to what we had in 2016, right? In 2016, there was a very clear leadership in Europe. Her name was Angela Merkel. We may like her or dislike her, but she was the kind of unquestioned leader in the EU that really stood for those norms and rules and the international order. And so, as I said, Merkel steps in while Trump steps out. And today, I think, as far as leadership is concerned in Europe, we have the problem that the strong leader, so the strongly Europeanist and committed leaders attached to that order are extremely weak. Think about France, think about Germany. And the leaders that are strong are nationalist leaders. They're Eurosceptic leaders. Think of my own Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, right? And so, in a sense, you don't have the kind of situation that you had in 2016, which makes it, and to sort of end and move back to the beginning of what I was saying, makes it far easier for Trump to pursue that divide and rule, in a sense, imperial agenda, right? Because you have all sorts of kind of useful idiots that you can play with and use, you know. So I've been aghast at times when, you know, I've heard these debates, oh, you know, can Giorgia Meloni be the Trump whisperer? And of course, you know, someone like her or like Orban or, you know, on the list, you know, if you count now the number of European governments which are either led by the far right or in which the far right is in government, right, maybe as a minority coalition partner, you're basically already at 9, with probably another 3 member states joining the list soon, right? If I think about the Czech Republic, Romania, and Austria. So the list is growing. And it's very clear that these governments, these leaders are not going to be, then, you know, to the extent that Trump would listen to anyone, right? They would not whisper the European interest in Trump's ear. If anything, they would be willing to be the Trumpian Trojan horses in Europe. And so I think, you know, why do I therefore say, you know, we're in a pretty bad spot? Because on the one hand, there's far greater determination that we're sensing and beginning to see from Washington, coupled with this already fragmentation and rising populism in Europe. It is really, in a sense, the perfect storm for the entire edifice to collapse. Or rather, I should say, which is actually far more dangerous, not to collapse. Because, in a sense, the risk of a collapse would be a far greater risk, right? When, for instance, going back to 2016, there was a sense of, oh my God, you know, there are countries that could leave the European Union. That sort of triggers an immune system and therefore leads to that sense of, you know, to that greater impulse towards unity that we saw that time around. Now the risk is that a Europe that dies in silence, right? Or a European Union that dies in silence. And it can happen in ways which are I mean, politically, we're already beginning to see it. Increasingly, you have the far right actually joining the majority in, for instance, the European Parliament in voting regulations and from resolutions to regulations, and therefore forming an alternative majority. And you see the way in which, even in apparently harmless terms like bureaucratic simplification, right? Ultimately, what lies behind, I'm not saying everything, but what can lie behind a term like this is actually an agenda for legislative regression, which, as far as Europe is concerned, essentially boils down to an agenda of disintegration. And so, this can happen very gradually. It can happen very much below the radar. It is very much, as I said, not only what Trump wants, but, another name that we haven't mentioned at all, Elon Musk. It's very clear what that particular project, as far as Europe is concerned. And, whether it is because of some sort of, neo-Nazi ideas, or whether it is because at the end of the day, if you have a group of 27 divided countries, it's far easier to make money. I mean, the bottom line is the same. And so I think there's essentially a convergence on the Trump-Musk front on the disintegration in Europe, and, sort of politically fertile ground in Europe at this point in time.
So Europe is between a rock and a hard place, I would say. And Sandra, we talked about Europe, we talked about distribution of power and the US status. And you referred to populism in the beginning. And I'm wondering, to what extent does populism shape today's international order? And what are its long-term effects on global stability and cooperation or competition?
Yeah, so I think this follows up here very nicely on several points that were mentioned. I think it's really important in order to try to think about the consequences of populism, more broadly speaking, on a global scale, in a way, and the diffusion of populism across world regions, to think about how impacts changes in the foreign policy of countries, national politics more in general. Basically, populism leads to changes via two mechanisms that we find almost in all places, in different shapes, in different intensities, but they matter a lot. And these are mobilization and personalization. So we're really looking into the state right now to see how this might matter then for foreign policy and international politics. So if we think of populism as a thin ideology, a set of ideas, which is really about thinking of society as having the people versus the elite, and politics, being the expression of the popular will, then this will lead to mobilization, because populist leaders, once they come to power, have this very strange dilemma of being themselves the elite, right? So they become the establishment, and what do they do in order to remain credible? They keep mobilizing. And this is what we're seeing with Trump right now, this constant mobilization. They're permanently on the campaign trail, even after having been voted into power. And this leads, of course, to this much stronger connection between the domestic and the international, to the politicization of foreign policy, but also to the need to follow up on, the broad claims you make in international politics. So the politicization of foreign policy, I think, is really an important dimension here that will force leaders at some point then also to follow up on the change they promised. The second dimension is personalization, and I mentioned it before briefly, and also Barry spoke about the illiberal dimension, the kind of advisors you have. So you see really leaders making decisions, taking power into their own hands. Why? Because populism is really about claiming to embody the popular will. There's excellent work by Nadia Urbinati on this, who says that the leader has this very strange notion of democratic representation, which is embodiment. Think of Narendra Modi standing on the Red Fort in Delhi and saying, "I am the voice of 1 billion countrymen," and he means it, right? So looking at leaders becomes important here. Of course, now connecting to structure, it makes a difference whether you're a leader in the sole remaining superpower or whatever you call it in the US, you have greater room to maneuver, or you're a leader somewhere else. But this personalization of decision-making, the narrowing down of the group of advisors, the group think that follows, this centralization, the killing of bureaucracies that we are seeing, not just in the US, in basically all places where populists govern. This also contributes to a reshaping foreign policy. Now, I think at the same time, we shouldn't be, we shouldn't conclude or draw too many conclusions from the case of Trump. Not all populists have the same structural preconditions, the same possibilities to really, change their country's foreign policies. So we should be careful. And we did a study on countries of the global south. We looked in detail at India, Bolivia, Philippines, Turkey, and we found that populist leaders, against our expectations, in some cases, were even more willing to engage in global governance, for example, in contributing to global public goods. You have Narendra Modi, a right-wing populist who, embraces renewable energies and wants to engage in climate change mitigation more than his non-populist predecessor, for example. You have Erdogan engaging in development cooperation, which has this mobilization dimension. It's about showing the domestic public that, Turkey is a great power. So you have very weird consequences of populist leaders centralizing, personalizing, mobilizing domestically, but doing, reasonably cooperative things internationally, right? So it's more complex. We should be careful about, drawing conclusions just from the case of the US. Now, connecting to what Natalie just said about Europe at the same time, there's a lot of research coming up now that really shows that populists, they might not be, exiting international organizations, they might engage even more, but adding this illiberal strand, having, trying to reshape organizations from within, making the most of them, benefiting from them, and at the same time giving them this illiberal twist. So this certainly also plays a role here, and it certainly matters also if we want to understand what effects this might have, populism more broadly speaking, on international order. So I don't think it involves like a total collapse of order as we know it, but certainly a shift in norms, and we're seeing this already. This emphasis on sovereignty, those illiberal elements coming in, the more transactional approach to these institutions. So I don't think this will lead to complete collapse of the institutions as we know them, but there are these, smaller creeping changes taking place there, very much driven by populism as such. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think we've covered a lot of ground in 50 minutes, and I'm sure we have many questions from the audience. So let's open the floor to the questions. And I'll start with one question for Barry. How could Trump possibly restore the US unipolar position if he is undermining the dollar centrality by imposing tariffs and regularizing cryptocurrencies?
I don't pretend to be an expert on currencies. So it's not easy for me to give what I would consider to be a well-informed answer to that question. But Trump is seldom truly consistent. And I don't think he simply listens to the advice of advisors who say, you can't do this because that could happen. I think his view is he can do this and then he can do something else to prevent that from happening. So we've seen him on the one hand talk about, sort of tariffs and whatnot. We've seen him talk about, attacking some of these institutions. He's, attacking free trade, but at the same time, he still talks about the strong dollar. And I think he likes the strong dollar because I think he likes debt, as he has said before, right? And my guess is that he probably, if you probed him, or if maybe you probe people around him, you might get the following answer on the dollar, right? The dollar is the world currency because people don't have much choice, right? And they don't have much choice because of America's material power and its secure position, right? So if you have American securities, you're probably going to get your money back. You're probably going to make some money. Inflation is probably going to be lower here than it is in other places. There's not going to be a nuclear war that destroys the United States and destroys your money. We have very big, deep capital markets, and capitalism is red in tooth and claw in the United States. So you can sell your bonds at a minute's notice. So there's lots of reasons why people are going to prefer our money, our paper, to other people's paper. And if he can grow our security position, our power position, our material position, that's going to grow. And if I had to guess, somebody might say to him, "Don't worry about it, boss. Whenever things become roiled in the world, people don't flee the dollar; they flee to it." Right. So, this is not your biggest issue. That's how I think the conversation would unfold.
We have a couple of questions about NATO and the transatlantic relation. So what do you think about the future of NATO and the transatlantic relations in the current order and under the current circumstances? Let's start with Natalie.
So, sort of the common mantra up until November was that indeed, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has tremendously strengthened NATO, and NATO somehow has returned to its original DNA that was always about the territorial defense of Europe. And in fact, not only has it refound its mission, but it's refound its cohesion. And in fact, it's even enlarged, of course, with the accession of Sweden and Finland. Now, of course, not only is, as we know, Trump is not fond of NATO, and what's he going to do? I mean, I actually don't think that he's going to pull out of NATO. But I think the question is actually not so much a Russia-Ukraine related question, but it's a Denmark-Greenland related question, right? Now, I don't imagine US troops to storm into Greenland. But I do think that Trump is quite serious in his intention to take over Greenland. And I think he's quite serious in using various mixes of coercive instruments to make that happen. Now, if that were to happen, right, where does that leave NATO? Right? I mean, where does it leave, it's such a sort of mad situation, but hypothetically, right? Sort of Denmark, obviously, I mean, what would it do? I mean, it would invoke an Article 5 because it's attacked by NATO's majority shareholder, right? I mean, this is completely, so in a sense, whereas we have traditionally thought about the sort of existential dangers to NATO that really have to do, because of course, as any organization, as any international law, is very much based on trust, right? And that's the kind of social contract on which it rests, right? And so when we thought about what are the existential dangers to NATO, the thinking was always along the lines of, well, maybe Putin may test Article 5 because he may sense that there's not much substance, in a sense, behind it. Now, alongside that particular kind of existential threat, which obviously is still there is, I think, this additional and perhaps even graver existential threat, which really has to do with, what if a NATO ally is attacked, and therefore would be, as I said, in the condition to invoke collective defense, but the only small problem is that it's attacked by, as I said, precisely the majority shareholder of that alliance. I think that in and of itself, even if, as I said, we don't end up with kind of troops storming into Greenland, would essentially spell the end of NATO.
Any other views on NATO or transatlantic relations?
This is Barry. I think it's pretty obvious that things are going to be quite tense. I think what was said earlier about Trump sort of attacking the EU and maybe hoping that it would shatter or weaken. I think that is his nature. I think his propensity is always to attack the weaker first, right? And so he starts with Greenland and Mexico, and then he mumbles about the European Union. So relations are not going to be good. And at the same time, I think I think the 5% number is just not even a trial balloon. It's just a opening bid. But I think they do want to see more spending out of the European members of the alliance, significantly more. And I'm guessing that spending alone isn't really going to cut it. That they want to see he's going to want to see spending that somehow redounds to the advantage of U.S. defense industry, which is exactly, I think, what most Europeans really don't want to do at this point. So I think we're heading for a really bad patch. And the real question, which I think Natalie raises is President Trump so committed to his current objectives that Greenland, for example, that blowing up the alliance is just fine with him? And what would his advisors tell him, even the ones that are most in sync with him? Would they counsel him in a way that says, we know what you want, we know why you want it, but we think we can restructure this alliance in a way that is really, really advantageous to us. But if you do this, i.e. Greenland, or if you do this other thing, which is to say, simply wipe your hands of Ukraine, then our potential for gain there goes away. I think that's the argument they will try and make to him. I don't know if the argument will work, but I do think we're heading for really dramatic transatlantic relations, period.
Okay, a dramatic period. Let's be prepared. And there's a question for Bill. Does the quantitative advantage of the dominant power, USA, still holds, or are we witnessing qualitative shifts that are reshaping the distribution of power? For instance, should China's expanding naval capabilities or its advancements in AI and quantum computing be seen as mere quantitative growth, or do they signify a deeper transformation in the global balance of power?
Well, that's a tough one. I would say that if by qualitative you mean a transformation in how international politics works so that we're back to something more like bipolarity, I'd say I'm still betting against it. I mean, you never know with these things, but I'm still betting against that kind of transformation. I think it's going to take a lot longer. That narrative basically usually it comes down to the idea of a leapfrog or a dramatic somehow overcoming of the normal barriers to technological and transformation. And the recent story about DeepSeek really feeds that narrative. Again, do I know that it's not going to be transformative? No, but historically, normally, those kinds of expectations are overcome by reality, and moreover, these transformations turn out to be way more complicated, take way more investments than you might think. So that's my take on that. I did want to say, though, that sort of tying that comment together with some of the recent comments about Trump is, I'll just be frank. Many of us, need sort of something to be comforted about, in these periods. It's looking pretty wild out there. And if you're an academic, one thing you can do is you can say, this is, as Barry said a while back, this is kind of a test. Now, I do think that is, say, American leverage. And what most international relations scholarship will tell you is that this kind of coercive leverage especially in the economic realm, is most effective against allies. So if sanctions work anywhere, they tend to work against allies. If this kinds of pressure works, so the leverage he has is probably greatest over allies. That doesn't mean he's going to use it in a way that's not going to generate all kinds of backlash. But I would say that the initial, if that scholarship is correct, the allies are going to try really, really hard to find a way to accommodate this rather than get into an out and out battle over this. I'm not saying that's not going to happen. The final thing I'll just say is a thought experiment, which is, when they came in, that is to say the Trump team, I really began to think, if they were really smart, I'm not smart, if they were really careful and Bismarckian, they could take all of these attributes, the sort of personalistic, the populist thing that Trump's got going, the mercurialness, the fact you can never pin him down, the fact that he's unchained by previous commitments and statements, and really do something pretty amazing. I mean, I really think if you think America is as powerful as I think it is, I think a leader like that, unhinged from a lot of prior commitments, both intellectual and bureaucratic and political, could have done a lot. But I just don't think this team is set up to do that. I just don't see the kind of strategy and careful moves that would be required to put a full test on who's right about American power. What I do know, just the final thing, is that one consistent thing about Trump is he does think American bargaining leverage is huge. He just thinks it's all that favors the United States, and the previous administrations have been stupid and unable to realize that. So that really resonates with a lot of the stuff that Barry was saying earlier.
I will continue with one question for Chandra. Is it still populism if everybody follows it?
Yes, it is. Because, I mean, here we're looking inside, right, the state and the idea of what society should look like according to these actors. So it's definitely populism if these actors claim to be against some elite at the international level and or domestically as well, and to speak in the name of the people, right? So you can still claim to be against the elite, for example, the US as the dominating power, and you see anti-Americanism as a widespread element among populist actors, even right-wing populists, which leads to very strange constellations, of course, if you have a right-wing populist government in power in the US, but right-wing populists in Europe, for example, being anti-American. So of course, there's no contradiction in the fact of having many populists in power in different places, and yes, this is still populism.
Thank you. As the interest is growing and we have many questions, I'll try to group questions. We have one question saying Trump's narrative is one of decline, out of conviction and as political tactic. In his foreign policy of assertiveness, as we now observe, a manifestation of decline or perception of decline. What are prospects for US-China relations if both fear decline? And another relevant question, do you think that Trump's America First policy can accelerate a shift towards a multipolar system by encouraging other actors to pursue greater strategic autonomy, or will it reinforce US dominance by showing the limitations of alternative kinds of power? And if so, can the US adapt to a multipolar system? Who wants to take the floor first?
I'll say something super quick. On the decline issue, I'll just, first of all, what politicians say about decline in general is to be taken with grains of salt. So I'm old enough to remember another president who was elected on the idea that America was in decline. His name was Ronald Reagan. And what's amazing is in the first year of his administration, miraculously, somehow that decline was absolutely instantly turned around. So the entire superpower that was in decline is now mooring in America. And the Reagan people sort of said, now we know, whereas just a year ago, we were saying that the military power of the United States is pathetic and the Soviet Union is getting stronger every day. Suddenly now America is capable and we can negotiate with the Soviets. If that was true of Reagan, I think it's triply, quadruply true of Trump. It's declined because Biden was in power. And now that he's in power, there's no decline. And so I'll go back to what I said on that before, that as far as what he thinks, there's a lot of things it's hard to say about Trump, but the fact that he thinks his bargaining power is really, really strong, especially against allies, that's just, I think that's I think we have a lot of evidence that he actually believes that. On the America First and where it will lead, I think it's a test of to what degree do all of these things we IR scholars study about reciprocity, about reputation, about the need for sustaining cooperation within institutions, about all those things we believe soft power, all this Joe Nye stuff, like all that we've had like 50 years of writing about how important all that stuff is. He's blowing it all out the window. And all I'm going to say is this, in a very narrow IR scholar view, which is if he actually does succeed in strengthening the U.S. position, a lot of shelves are groaning under the weight of books and articles by IR scholars that are totally wrong.
Any other views on this?
Let me perhaps just add a couple of reflections on this US-China story and then perhaps adding the European angle to it. And to be honest, actually, I think this can really go in very different ways, yeah? Because, I mean, it is clear that, the competition is there and that Trump is going to, may well double down, and certainly his administration is kind of, full of China hawks and all the rest of it. However, I think, and this goes back to the sort of transactionalism, I think that there's also a scenario out there, and I tend to exclude the possibility of some sort of grand bargain, but I do think that there is actually quite a bit of scope for, in a sense, sort of more sectoral deals, if you like. But for two sets of reasons. I mean, firstly, because I don't actually think that Trump himself is into this kind of strategic competition kind of business, right? I don't think it's the way he really thinks about it, right? And on the other hand, because I actually think that China has quite a few cards to play. So it can give something on trade, it can give something on investment, it can give something on the containment of the Iranian nuclear program. It could, I'm not sure it would, but it could give something on the Russia-Ukraine front. So there are quite a few. I mean, it could buy more American LNG. So, I mean, there's quite a bit there in the sense that if China plays its cards smartly, it can actually entice basically Trump into sort of bits of a deal at least. And then the other thing that I wanted, so you could see things going in two diametrically opposite directions. The other reflection, which also brings us in two diametrically opposite directions, is how Europe fits into all of this. Because I think there's one scenario in which, here are the weak Europeans, they're going to bend over backwards to try and please Trump, and to the extent that they think that Trump wants them to be hard on China, they're going to double down on their own assertiveness towards China, be it on tariffs or other. But I do think that, and again, I think it largely depends on how China itself is going to play this game. There is also a scenario out there in which essentially Europe kind of says to itself, well, we can't really afford a two-front trade war, both with the United States and with China. We can't really afford a system in which multilateralism totally collapses. I mean, don't forget that in Trump 1, actually, the EU-China relationship had actually improved rather significantly, largely because China had played up its own sort of, and we stand for multilateralism sort of line. So, there is, again, a sort of scenario out there in which, paradoxically, Trump's abrasiveness could actually push Europeans into China's arms.
Thank you. Barry had to leave. He says many thanks and goodbye to everyone. I think we will continue for some more minutes and take a couple of questions. For anyone of the panelists, what is the future of the norm of sovereignty in international relations, given that most major players, Russia, China, and the US, are increasingly disregarding it?
Could maybe try to make a start just by quickly pointing at this paradox situation in a way of, that we're observing violations of this fundamental principle as we haven't seen them in a long while, of course, with Russia's attack against Ukraine being the most blatant example. But at the same time, and just going back to the issue of the rise of populism, for example, this notion of sovereignty, of popular sovereignty, is central and fundamental in the worldview of several of these actors. At the same time, also, we haven't talked much of the global south today, but in large parts of the world, this emphasis on sovereignty is crucial. So you have the calling into question of sovereignty, it's weakening, and at the same time, it's coming back again and it's being strengthened. And there's so many actors pushing for it in a very different way. So I think we might observe, very interesting normative shifts in how this norm is understood and interpreted in different parts of the world.
Thank you. Sandra, any other views? Another question, most of the discussion is focused on the role of nation state in the current world order. And what is the role for regional organizations like the European Union, African Union, Mercosur, or the ASEAN? And we have also another question that mentions the role of non-state actors in the current order. What do you think, Natalie?
I mean, on the non-state actors, it seems to me that the big story, obviously here and over the last couple of months, is really the whole sort of tech bro kind of story, right? But having said this, I do think what is, in this whole kind of debate about, this kind of new oligarchy in the United States and the role of big tech and so on, I do think, and this goes back to this question of the role of the state, that for all the power of these companies, including Elon Musk, I think actually what we're seeing is that at the end of the day, they still do need the state, right? I mean, we wouldn't have seen, as far as, let's put Musk to one side, let's think of everyone else. But we wouldn't have seen the sort of, procession to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring had it not been for an understanding that state power is important for them to make more money, right? And I think on the Musk side of the equation, as Musk himself proceeds in doing what he's doing, including what he's, sort of in terms of, frankly speaking, violating laws and, and perhaps all the way down to the Constitution, I think that he himself will increasingly require the protection of the state, read Donald Trump, precisely as a consequence of what he's doing. And so, in a kind of twisted way, despite the fact that I think at this point in time, we're really seeing the rise of those particular non-state actors, but in a way actually which doesn't necessarily undermine, in fact, it even reinforces the supremacy of the state itself.
Thank you. There are many questions. It's hard to choose, and it's hard to respond to them all. Let's try a last one. What relevance, if any, do you see that religion seems to be playing in the geopolitical struggles we are seeing now? Is the idea of America First and Project 2025 not so much nationalism, but rather civilizationalism, Western Judeo-Christianity?
just a short, quick start moving perhaps the focus from just religion to ideologies more broadly, in which religions, play a very big role. But I think, we should really gain a deeper understanding of the, I would call it, thick ideological foundations of many of the policies we see out there. And we have, right-wing governments with, Hindu nationalism in India. It has been labeled differently. Muslim nationalism was one of the labels in Turkey, for example. And now I'm certainly not an expert on the US, but in these countries, these are elements that shape also foreign policy. So, for example, in India, which is the country I know best of these, Hindu nationalist ideas have been used to justify protectionism and the notion of self-reliance, couched in terms coming from the Hindu nationalist tradition. So this is definitely something that should be studied more. And now on the US side of things, I'll step back.
Bill, what do you think?
I very much agree with that. I mean, the recent comments from Natalie and, I mean, they're getting at both the sort of sovereignty thing, you were seeing this increased importance of the nation state. But the only thing I would say with that specific question on the Trump movement, the MAGA, Make America Great Again, America First movement, is that if I had to place my bets, it would be on nationalism as opposed to any transnational commitments, even transnational commitments to other, let's say, white European Christian, if you want to get into that. There are people who speak of such kinds of brotherhood, but it's nationalism first, nationalism always for a lot of those people. And if you look at some of the ideological, again, I don't know how important they are, but if you kind of read what J.D. Vance says, if you read what Steve Bannon says, and, it's about the United States of America as the only way to really organize society in today's crazy world. You've got to cling to that thing, and that's your country. So I think that would end up taking prominence over any transnational commitments.
Thank you. This has been a rich and insightful discussion on the changing international order, the role of key actors, and the broader dynamic shaping our world today. I want to thank all our panelists for their thought-provoking insights, and all of you for joining us. Check out our upcoming online events on the EISA and ISA platforms. Next week, EISA is hosting an event on mobility injustices for scholars at risk. I know that ISA hosts an event on Ukraine. And if you'd like to continue these conversations, consider submitting work to EISA's and ISA's conferences. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing many of you at future events.